The night the power went out at the school dance. My crush and I were trapped in the library. The lights died at exactly 8:47 p.m., and in the 3 seconds of total darkness that followed, I heard the one voice in the entire gymnasium that could make my heart stop and restart at the same time. She said my name. Not a scream, not a gasp like everyone else around us. Just my name, quiet and certain. Like she already knew I was the one person in that crowd of 200 sweating, panicking teenagers who would come find her. What happened in the 4 hours after that blackout changed both of our lives so completely that neither of us has ever been able to describe it the same way twice. This is the truth, as close as I can tell it, about the night everything I thought I knew about love, fear, and second chances came apart in the dark and put itself back together in the light of a dying phone screen, surrounded by books nobody had opened in years. My name is Mason Whitfield, and before that night, I was exactly the kind of person nobody expects a story to happen to. I want you to picture the least remarkable boy in your high school. The one who sits 3 rows from the back in every class, who raises his hand maybe twice a semester, who eats lunch with the same 2 friends every single day because trying new tables feels like walking into traffic. That was me. 17 years old, decent grades, no enemies, no real friends outside my tiny circle, and one secret so heavy I carried it like a stone in my chest for 2 years. I was in love with Harper Bellwether, and I was absolutely certain she didn't know I existed. If you believe that people deserve second chances, that kindness shown in the dark can change the whole shape of someone's life, then before we go any further, do something for me. Hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, share this with someone who still believes in the kind of love that sneaks up on you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to Tender Truths, because we tell stories like this one every single week, and I promise you, this one is worth staying for until the very last minute. Now let me take you back to the beginning, to the version of Harper Bellwether that existed in my mind before I ever really knew her, because that version was almost nothing like the real girl I met that night. Harper had transferred to Millbrook High at the start of sophomore year, and she arrived the way certain people just arrive, without trying, and immediately became the gravitational center of every hallway she walked through. She had this laugh that carried, this way of tilting her head when she was actually listening to you instead of waiting for her turn to talk, and a habit of wearing her older brother's flannel shirts over floral dresses like she hadn't quite decided which version of herself she wanted to be that day, and somehow that made her more compelling, not less. She ran cross-country. She was in the school's small jazz band, playing a battered trumpet that had clearly been through 3 older siblings before her. She volunteered at the animal shelter on weekends, and I knew that only because I'd seen a photo once, posted by someone else, of her sitting on the concrete floor of a kennel with a 3-legged dog asleep in her lap, and I had stared at that picture for so long that my phone screen had locked itself out of pity. I had never spoken to her. Not once, not really. We'd had 2 classes together over 2 years, and in both of them I had positioned myself carefully so I could see her without her ever having a reason to look back at me. That was the architecture of my devotion, if you can call it that. Distant, careful, entirely one-sided, and entirely mine. I told myself that this was safer. If I never said anything, she could never say no. If I never tried, I could never really fail. It's a coward's logic, and I knew it even then, but knowing something is cowardly doesn't automatically give you the courage to stop. My 2 friends, Theo Okonkwo Baptiste and a girl named Priya Ramaswamy, who had been folded into our little group since freshman year gym class, knew about my feelings for Harper the way you know about a family member's chronic illness. It was just always there, quietly, in the background of every conversation, occasionally flaring up and demanding attention, mostly managed and unspoken. Theo used to tell me, with the particular bluntness only a childhood best friend can get away with, that I was going to graduate, go to whatever college would take me, and spend the rest of my life wondering about a girl I had never once had a real conversation with. He wasn't wrong to worry. I wasn't wrong to be terrified. The fall formal that year was going to be held in the school gymnasium, decorated by the student council into something the flyers called a midnight garden, which in practice meant several $100s of fairy lights strung from the basketball hoops and a fog machine that the janitor, Mr. Alvarez, had strong opinions about turning off early. I almost didn't go. I had already built the excuse in my head. Something about a headache. Something vague enough that Theo wouldn't push too hard. But Priya, in her infinite and slightly terrifying wisdom, cornered me at my locker 3 days before the dance and told me that if I didn't go, She was personally going to walk up to Harper Bellwether in the cafeteria and tell her exactly how long I'd been in love with her. I went to the dance. I want to be clear that I went out of fear, not courage. The courage came later, in the dark, when I had no other choice. The night of the dance, Millbrook's gymnasium had actually, against all odds, achieved something close to magic. The overhead fluorescents were off, replaced by strings of warm white lights that crisscrossed the ceiling in uneven, hand-strung patterns, and someone on the decorating committee had found real potted ferns and small trees to line the walls, so that walking in felt less like entering a gym that smelled permanently of rubber and floor wax and more like stepping into some half-real forest clearing. The DJ, a senior named Reyes who did this every year for extra credit in the audio production elective, had the bass turned up just enough that you could feel it in your ribs. I stood near the back wall in a rented navy suit that didn't quite fit in the shoulders, nursing a paper cup of punch that tasted mostly of artificial lime, and I watched Harper Bellwether from across the room the way I had watched her from across classrooms for 2 straight years. She was wearing a deep green dress that night, something simple and unfussy, and her dark hair was pulled back except for a few pieces that had already escaped near her temples from dancing too hard too early in the evening. She was laughing at something her friend Delaney had said, head thrown back, one hand pressed flat against her own collarbone, the way people do when a laugh catches them by surprise. I remember thinking, with the particular clarity of a boy who has spent 2 years perfecting the art of longing from a distance, that I would probably remember that exact image of her for the rest of my life. I had no idea, standing there with warm lime punch going flat in my hand, how right I was, or how wrong I was about why. At 8:40 p.m., 7 minutes before everything changed, I made a decision that felt, at the time, like the single bravest act of my entire adolescence. I put down my cup, I crossed the gym floor, and I walked up to Harper Bellwether to ask her to dance. I need you to understand what that cost me. Every step across that floor felt like walking against a current, my heart slamming so hard against my ribs that I was half convinced people could hear it over Reyes's speakers. I had rehearsed maybe 4 different opening lines in the bathroom mirror that afternoon and forgotten every single one of them by the time I was 3 feet away from her. What actually came out of my mouth was something embarrassingly simple, just her name, and then, "Do you want to dance?" And I remember bracing for the polite confusion, the kind rejection that I had spent 2 years imagining in exhaustive masochistic detail. She said yes. I want to sit in that moment for a second, because it matters for everything that came after. She said yes, and there was no hesitation in it, no pity, nothing that suggested she was doing me some kind of charitable favor. She just smiled, this small, real smile, and said, "Finally," like she'd been waiting for me to ask, which made absolutely no sense to the boy who had spent 2 years convinced he was invisible to her. And she took my hand, and we walked out onto the floor together as Reyes faded into a slower song, something with a lot of reverb and a singer whose name I never learned but whose voice I will hear in my head for the rest of my life whenever I think about that night. We had been dancing for exactly 7 minutes, badly, both of us laughing about how badly, when the entire gymnasium went black. Not dim, not flickering, black, total and absolute, the kind of dark you almost never experience in a modern building full of exit signs and emergency lighting, because for one disorienting, terrifying stretch of maybe 4 or 5 seconds, even those failed. The music cut off mid-note with a sound like something dying. 200 voices, which had been a low roar of chatter and laughter a moment before, spiked into something sharper, a chorus of gasps and a few actual screams. The particular high, startled screams of teenagers who have never once in their sheltered lives experienced real darkness and don't know yet whether to be scared or delighted by it. And in that darkness, with her hand still loosely in mine because neither of us had let go yet, Harper Bellwether said my name. Not screamed it. Said it low and steady, like she was checking that I was still there, like out of 200 people around her in that gym, I was the coordinate she reached for first. I said her name back, and I felt her fingers tighten around mine, and somewhere behind us a teacher's voice, Mr. Castellano I think, was shouting for everyone to stay calm. Stay where you are. The emergency lights will kick on any second. The emergency lights did not kick on any second. They took almost 2 full minutes, and in the retelling later, from the maintenance staff and eventually the fire marshal who came out the next day, we learned that the blackout wasn't just the gym. A transformer down the block had failed, taking out power to the entire east side of the school and half the surrounding neighborhood. And the backup generator that was supposed to handle the school's emergency systems had a fault in it that nobody had caught in the last inspection. So for those 2 minutes, in real, unbroken darkness, 200 kids in formal wear stood packed into a gymnasium with no light at all, and panic, the low, contagious kind that spreads through a crowd like a change in air pressure, started to build. I felt it happen. I felt the crowd around us shift from confused to frightened, felt bodies pressing closer together as people who couldn't see anything instinctively reached for the nearest solid thing. And I felt Harper's hand grip mine harder, and in the dark, close enough that I could feel her breath. She said something I will never forget as long as I live. She said, "I don't like this, Mason. Can we get somewhere quieter?" And it was the first time in 2 years that I had ever heard her say my name like it was a fact she was certain of rather than a guess she was making. And something in me, some version of myself I had never met before, simply took over. I knew the school. 2 years of walking its halls between classes had put a map of it into my body that I could access without thinking. And I knew that the library, just off the side hallway near the gym's east exit, would be close, would be mostly empty because nobody uses the library on a dance night, and would have its own separate lighting circuit because it ran on the older part of the building's electrical system, a fact I only knew because my mom, an electrician by trade, had once complained for 20 straight minutes at dinner about how badly Millbrook's original 1970s wiring had aged. I told Harper to hold onto my arm, and I told her we were going to move slow, and I started walking us both toward that side exit, one hand out in front of me like a man wading into water he can't see the bottom of. It took maybe 90 seconds, though it felt like much longer, 90 seconds of shuffling through a crowd of frightened, shouting classmates in the pitch black, my shoulder catching other shoulders, someone's elbow catching my ribs hard enough to bruise, Harper's hand a fixed point on my forearm the entire way, until we found the door, and I pushed it open, and the hallway beyond it, lit by the faint emergency glow of a single battery-powered exit sign, felt like stepping into daylight by comparison. The library door was unlocked because the librarian, Ms. Okafor, always left it that way during evening events in case any teacher needed a quiet space. And I pushed it open, and Harper and I stumbled through together, out of the noise and the crush of the crowd, into a silence so sudden and complete it felt like its own kind of shock. That was the moment the story really begins. Not the blackout, not the dance. That doorway, that silence, the two of us standing there in the dark, catching our breath, with absolutely no idea that we were about to spend the next 4 hours locked, quite literally, inside that room together, and that by the time we walked back out, I would no longer be the invisible boy from the back row, and Harper Bellwether would no longer be the untouchable girl I had loved from a distance for 2 years. We would just be Mason and Harper, two people who had found each other in the dark and decided, against every instinct either of us had ever trusted before, to stay. If this story is already pulling at something in you, if you know exactly what it feels like to love someone from a distance and wonder if you'll ever get your one chance, stay with me, because what happened in that library over the next 4 hours is the part of the story I think about every single day of my life, and I promise you it gets so much bigger than either of us expected. The library at Millbrook High was not a large room. Rows of low shelving ran down its center, maybe 8 of them, packed with the kind of books that had clearly not been checked out in a decade. Oversized encyclopedias, dusty sets of the classics nobody assigned anymore, a surprisingly extensive true crime section that Ms. Okafor had a personal fondness for. Along the far wall, tall windows looked out over the courtyard, and it was through those windows, once our eyes adjusted, that we could see the faintest gray-blue wash of moonlight, enough to make out shapes if not details. There was a reading nook near those windows, a cluster of worn armchairs and a low table that had clearly been someone's idea of making the space feel less institutional, and it was toward that nook, once we caught our breath, that we instinctively drifted. I want to tell you honestly that the first 10 minutes were awkward in a way that almost undid the strange magic of the moment before it. We sat down in those armchairs, a careful 3 feet apart, and neither of us said anything for what felt like an eternity. Both of us listening to the muffled chaos still audible through the walls, the shouting, the sound of teachers organizing people, someone's phone flashlight throwing a thin beam under the door and then moving away again. I remember being desperately aware of every breath I took, terrified that whatever strange bravery had gotten me across that gym floor and through that dark hallway had burned itself out entirely, leaving behind the same tongue-tied boy who had spent 2 years failing to say a single word to her. It was Harper who broke the silence, and what she said surprised me so much that I actually laughed out loud. the first real sound either of us had made since the door closed behind us. She asked me if I thought Mr. Alvarez's fog machine had started the whole thing, if maybe he'd finally overloaded a circuit with it after 3 years of complaints from the fire marshal, and there was something so specific, so absurdly normal about the question, that it cracked the tension wide open. I told her that if the fog machine really had taken down the entire east side of the neighborhood's power grid, it deserved to be in the yearbook. She laughed, really laughed, the same head-thrown-back laugh I had watched from across rooms for 2 years, except this time it was because of something I'd said, and something shifted in my chest that I can only describe as the sound of a very old, very heavy door swinging open. We talked for a while about small things first, the way people do when they're testing whether it's safe to talk about bigger things. She told me about the 3-legged dog from the shelter, whose name turned out to be Biscuit, and who she was very obviously and very hopelessly trying to convince her parents to adopt. I told her about my mom's 20-minute rant about Millbrook's electrical system, and she laughed again and said that explained how I'd known exactly where to go in the dark, and there was something in the way she said it, something like admiration, that made my ears go hot even in a room with no light to show it. Eventually, maybe 40 minutes in, once it became clear that the power wasn't coming back anytime soon and that the teachers outside had things reasonably under control without needing us to reappear immediately, the conversation slid somewhere deeper, the way conversations do in the dark, when you can't see someone's face clearly enough to read their reaction to what you're about to say, which paradoxically makes it easier to say true things. Harper asked me, out of nowhere, why I had never talked to her before that night. Not unkindly, genuinely curious, like it was a puzzle she'd noticed and filed away without quite solving. I could have lied. I could have said something easy, that I was shy, that I didn't know she'd want to talk to someone like me, and both of those things were technically true, but neither of them was the real answer. What I actually told her, sitting 3 feet away from her in the dark with my heart hammering so hard I was sure she could hear it, was the truth. I told her I'd liked her since sophomore year, since the first week she transferred in, and that I had never said anything because I was terrified that if I did, and she said no, I would lose even the version of her I already had, the one where I got to watch her laugh across a classroom and imagine, safely, from a distance, what it might be like if things were different. I told her that loving her quietly for 2 years had felt safer than the alternative, even though some part of me knew, even as I did it, that it was actually the coward's choice, not the safe one. There was a silence after I said that, long enough that I started to panic, started composing the apology I would give for making things weird, for ruining whatever fragile, strange good thing had been building between us in that dark room. And then Harper said something that I have replayed in my head more times than I could possibly count in the years since. She said that she remembered me, not vaguely, not as a face she half recognized. She said she remembered a boy in her freshman English elective sophomore year who had once, without being asked, given up his seat by the window so a new transfer student who clearly didn't know anyone yet wouldn't have to sit alone in the back corner, and that she had thought about that small, unremarkable kindness more times over the following 2 years than she probably should have, and had always wondered why that same boy never talked to her again. I didn't remember doing that. I want to be honest about that, because it's part of what makes this whole thing feel less like a movie and more like real life. I had done something small and thoughtless and immediately forgotten it, the kind of tiny decent act you don't even register as meaningful in the moment, and it had apparently lodged itself in her memory for 2 solid years, becoming, in her mind, the first data point in a story about me that I hadn't even known I was writing. It taught me something that night that I still believe with my whole chest, that the smallest kindnesses we offer without thinking are so often the ones that matter most to the people who receive them, and we almost never find out because we're too busy assuming we're invisible. We sat with that for a while, both of us a little stunned, I think, by how much closer we suddenly felt than we had any right to feel after less than an hour alone together. And that's when the second wave of the night's chaos began, because somewhere around the 50-minute mark, we heard footsteps and voices in the hallway outside, teachers apparently doing a final headcount sweep before locking down the parts of the building that weren't actively being used for the evacuation staging area in the main lobby. And neither of us thought anything of it until we heard the unmistakable, heavy click of the library's exterior hallway door being locked from the outside. We would later confirm, one of exactly 2 rooms in the entire building that got missed in the headcount, a library nobody expected students to be hiding in during a school dance, its door pushed nearly shut by the draft from the open hallway door, easy to overlook in a chaotic, dark, understaffed evacuation. Harper and I looked at each other, or rather, looked at the vague dark shape of each other, And I think we both understood the situation at almost the exact same moment, because she said, with a kind of disbelieving, slightly hysterical laugh in her voice, that we were actually literally locked in the library, and I remember feeling two completely contradictory things at once. A genuine spike of fear, because being accidentally locked in a dark building during a citywide power outage is objectively a frightening situation for two 17-year-olds to be in, and underneath that fear, something else, something I was almost ashamed of feeling, a small, private relief that we now had no choice but to stay exactly where we were, together, for however long it took someone to notice we were missing. If you've ever been afraid of something and secretly grateful for it at the same time, you already understand exactly what that next hour felt like for me. We tried the door, obviously, more than once, and it was well and truly locked, one of those old commercial doors with a deadbolt mechanism that latched automatically once it swung shut. No possible way to open it from the inside without a key. We checked our phones and found that both of us had reception, thin and unreliable given whatever was happening to the cell towers in the outage, but enough, eventually, to send a text. I texted Theo. Harper texted her friend Delaney. And then we did what you do when you've sent out a flare into the dark and have no idea when or if it will be answered. We waited and we kept talking, because talking was the only thing keeping either of us from sitting in silence with our own fear. It was during that waiting, sometime in the second hour, that the conversation moved from the safe, careful confessions of the first hour into something rawer. Harper told me, somewhere in the dark, surrounded by unread encyclopedias and the faint blue moonlight through those tall windows, about her older brother, whose flannel shirts she wore, and who had joined the army the year before and was currently stationed somewhere she wasn't allowed to say much about, and how the not knowing, the long silences between his calls, had become this constant low hum of anxiety underneath everything else in her life, a fear she almost never talked about because everyone around her seemed to expect her to be the bright, laughing, unbothered girl she'd always been, and she didn't know how to be scared out loud without disappointing that expectation. I understood that more than I think she realized because I had my own version of it, quieter and less dramatic but real in its own way. My parents had separated that spring, not violently, not even particularly dramatically, just a slow, sad unraveling that had left our house feeling like two people living carefully around each other's schedules, and I had spent the last several months performing a kind of steadiness for both of them that I didn't actually feel, because I'd noticed, the few times I'd let the mask slip, how much it seemed to hurt them to see me hurting too, and so I'd learned to just not let it slip, not with them, not with Theo, not with anyone. I told her all of that, in pieces in that dark library, in a way I hadn't told anyone, and she listened the way she'd listened to Delaney across the gym floor hours earlier, head tilted, fully present, and when I finished she didn't try to fix it or minimize it. She just said that it sounded exhausting, holding all of that alone, and something about having it named so simply, so accurately, by someone who had no obligation to care and chose to anyway, undid something in me that I hadn't realized was wound so tight. We are now roughly 2 hours into the story, and if you're the kind of person who believes that the right person can find you in the darkest, most unexpected moments of your life, I need you to do one more thing for me before we keep going. Type the word trust in the comments below if you believe that the truth we tell in the dark is often more honest than anything we manage to say in the light. And let's see how many of you out there understand exactly what I mean. Somewhere around the 2.5 hour mark, the library, which had felt cavernous and strange when we first stumbled into it, had begun to feel almost impossibly small, in the good way, the way a space feels when the person inside it with you has become the only thing that matters in it. We had moved from the armchairs to the floor at some point, backs against the low shelving, close enough now that our shoulders touched, and Harper had found, by feel more than sight, an old paperback flashlight-style reading lamp clipped to one of the shelves, the kind libraries sometimes keep for exactly this sort of emergency, its battery weak but functional, throwing a small, warm circle of yellow light onto the carpet between us. In that little pool of light, we did something that felt, at 17, almost dangerously intimate. We actually looked at each other, really looked, for the first time since the blackout started. And I remember thinking that Harper Bellwether, lit by a dying reading lamp on a library floor, her hair coming further loose from its pins, mascara slightly smudged from either laughing or the earlier fear, looked more real and more beautiful to me than she ever had across any classroom or gymnasium, because for the first time in 2 years, I wasn't watching her from a careful, cowardly distance. I was right there, close enough to see the small scar above her left eyebrow that she told me came from a bicycle accident when she was 9, close enough to see the exact moment her expression shifted from talking to listening to something else entirely. It was Harper who asked, in that little pool of lamplight, whether I was going to try to kiss her, and I want to tell you that I said something smooth and confident, but the truth is I just laughed, nervous and a little breathless, and told her I'd been trying to work up the nerve for approximately 4 hours and possibly 2 years before that, and she smiled and closed the distance herself. I'm not going to describe that kiss in some overwrought cinematic way, because it doesn't need it. What I'll tell you is that it felt like every ounce of fear I had carried for 2 straight years, the fear of rejection, the fear of being seen and found wanting, simply dissolved, replaced by something so much larger and quieter and more certain. And that when we finally pulled apart, both of us a little stunned, Harper pressed her forehead against mine in the dim lamplight and said, very softly, that she was glad the power went out, and I told her I was too, and I meant it more than I had ever meant anything in my entire life. We stayed like that for a while, foreheads together, hands finding each other's in the small warm circle of light, and it was in that stillness, that suspended private hour, that Harper told me something that reframed the entire night for me. She said that she had noticed me long before that dance, had noticed me across 2 years of shared classes, had wondered more than once why the quiet boy who'd given up his seat for her freshman year never seemed to look at her the way plenty of other boys did, obviously, hopefully, and had assumed reasonably that I simply wasn't interested. She said that watching me work up the courage to ask her to dance that night had been, in its own small way, one of the bravest things she'd ever seen someone do, because she could see exactly how much it cost me, and that bravery, more than anything else, more than looks or charm or any of the easier currencies people trade in at 17, was the thing that had made her say yes so quickly before I even finished asking. I think about that a lot, the idea that the thing she found most compelling about me wasn't some hidden confidence I'd been suppressing, but the plain, visible fact of my fear and my willingness to walk through it anyway. It's a lesson I carry with me still, years later, that the people worth loving aren't looking for someone who's never afraid. They're looking for someone who's afraid and shows up regardless. We talked for another hour after that, softer now, slower, the urgency of the earlier confessions replaced by something calmer, the kind of talking two people do when they've already said the hardest, truest things and are simply enjoying the novelty of being fully known by someone new. She told me about her plans to study wildlife biology, about a summer she'd spent at a rescue ranch in Colorado that had changed how she thought about her whole future. I told her, for the first time out loud to anyone, that I wanted to be an electrician like my mom, not because it was expected of me, but because I'd spent my whole childhood watching her fix things other people had given up on. And there was something in that work, something almost sacred, about restoring light to places that had gone dark, that I wanted for my own life. Neither of us could have known, sitting on that library floor, how strange and fitting it was that I'd end up saying that on the exact night a blackout had brought us together. Around the 3-hour mark, we heard the searching. Voices in the hallway, flashlight beams sweeping under the door, Theo's voice specifically, cracking with something between relief and irritation as he called my name through the door. Having apparently spent the better part of an hour badgering Mr. Castellano, and eventually the school's head custodian into doing a proper room-by-room check once my text started sounding worried enough. The door finally opened at 12:52 a.m., power still not restored to that part of the building, but a maintenance crew having arrived with proper master keys and flashlights, and the flood of light and noise and relieved, exhausted adults that poured into that little library felt, for a moment, like an intrusion into something that had belonged only to the two of us. I won't pretend the rest of that night was simple. There were worried parents to call, a slightly chaotic scene in the school's main lobby where Harper and I were both, separately, hugged fiercely by mothers who had spent 2 hours imagining the worst, a brief and mortifying conversation with Principal Sandoval about school policy regarding students in locked areas during emergencies. none of which, notably, either of us actually cared about, because we kept finding each other's eyes across the chaos of that lobby. And every single time we did, Harper would smile that same small, real smile from the dance floor 4 hours and an entire lifetime earlier, and I understood, with a certainty I had never felt about anything before, that whatever had happened in that library wasn't going to end when the lights came back on. If this story has moved you even a little, if some part of you recognizes what it feels like to be truly seen by someone for the first time, I need you to know that this is exactly the moment in the video where I ask you to stay with me, because we're almost at the end, and what happened in the weeks and months after that night is, I think, the part of this story that will stay with you the longest. The days immediately following the dance were strange in the particular way that only teenagers can make strange, because our entire school had somehow found out, within about 48 hours, that Mason Whitfield and Harper Bellwether had been trapped together in the library during the blackout, and the rumor mill did what rumor mills do, exaggerating and inventing details neither of us recognized until the actual, quieter truth of what had happened between us felt almost too fragile to say out loud in the middle of all that noise. But Harper, who I was learning had a spine of quiet steel underneath all that warmth, simply found me at my locker on the Monday after the dance, in front of God and everybody, and asked if I wanted to walk to first period with her, and something about the plainness of that request, the way she refused to let the rumor mill turn something real into something cheap, told me everything I needed to know about who she actually was. We started, slowly and then not so slowly, becoming something neither of us had words for yet. And I want to be honest that it wasn't a fairy tale in the way this story might make it sound. There were awkward moments, misread signals, one genuinely terrible argument in November about a canceled movie plan that neither of us handled particularly maturely, the ordinary friction of two people learning each other for real instead of from a careful, admiring distance. But underneath all of that ordinary mess was something that had been forged in that dark library and never quite left us. An ease with telling each other the truth, even the scared, unflattering parts, because we'd already done the hardest version of that on a library floor lit by a dying flashlight, and everything after that felt, by comparison, survivable. I told her, eventually, months later, about my parents' separation finalizing, about how much harder that spring was than I let anyone see, and she sat with me through it the way I'd sat with her fear about her brother, not trying to fix it, just staying. Her brother came home safely on leave that winter, and I got to meet him, awkwardly, at her family's kitchen table, wearing one of his own flannel shirts that Harper had finally given back, and he shook my hand and told me, with the particular bluntness of an older sibling who has heard every detail of a story secondhand, that he'd heard I was the guy who found his sister in the dark, and that in his family that meant something. We dated all through the rest of high school. I'm not going to tell you this story ends with some grand, permanent forever, because I think real stories, honest ones, don't need that kind of ending to matter. What I can tell you is that 4 years later, we are both in college, different states, a long-distance relationship that has had its own hard nights, its own version of darkness we've had to find our way through without the convenient magic of a library floor and a dying flashlight. But we are still finding our way through it, together on purpose every single day, because somewhere in that first dark night, we learned something about each other and about ourselves that neither of us has ever forgotten. That the bravest thing you can do isn't waiting for the perfect moment when nothing could possibly go wrong. It's reaching for someone's hand in the dark anyway, and choosing, again and again, to stay. If the story touched your heart even a little, if it reminded you of your own moment of courage, or the person you're still waiting to be brave enough to reach for, please take a second right now and leave a like on this video, and let us at Tender Truths know in the comments. It genuinely means more to us than you know, and it helps stories like Mason and Harper's find the people who need to hear them most. And before we close this one out, I want to ask you for something a little different, something special. Down in the comments, I want you to write the exact words, "I would have followed you into the dark." If any part of this story made you believe, even for a moment, in the kind of love that finds you exactly when you need it most. I read every single one of those comments myself, and on nights when I doubt whether stories like this still matter to anyone, seeing that sentence from strangers all over the world reminds me why we keep telling them. Mason and Harper are still together today, still choosing each other across the distance, still occasionally teasing each other about a fog machine that may or may not have taken down half a neighborhood's power grid on one unforgettable October night. And somewhere in a box in Harper's childhood bedroom, tucked inside the pages of an old paperback she borrowed and never returned from the Millbrook High Library, there is a small, cheap reading lamp with a dead battery, kept not because it works anymore, but because of exactly what it lit up on the one night neither of them will ever forget. If you believe believe, like I do, that the truest connections in this life often find us in the moments we least expect, when we're standing in the dark with no idea what happens next. Then thank you for staying until the end of this one, and I will see you in the very next story.